Okay, this morning we're launching into a brand new teaching series. We're going to be going into the book of Colossians. And as we launch into this series this morning, I want to really kind of do more of a bit of an introduction to this book and kind of talk about the angle that we're coming from. And I want to start with this kind of caveat, this question, if you like. I want you to consider this for a moment. What does someone like the Apostle Paul, the author of this letter to the church in Colossae, what does the Apostle Paul, a first century Jew, have to say to a bunch of people like you and I here in the 21st century? And I say that in light of the fact that, we kind of live, don't we, in peculiar times. There's lots of things going on in our world at the moment. There's war, there's political upheaval, there's economic crisis. I mean, if you were to just step back the last decade, and look forward, would we have believed that we would have seen all that we've seen in the last 10 years? I don't think we would have done. Lots of things about life and normality have changed for many of us. We're told, aren't we, and this was coined by a film director called Adam Curtis. He made this film called Hypernormalization. I think it's still on BBC iPlayer. If you haven't watched it, you might want to check it out. But in that film, he said, we live in a post-truth world. And if you haven't seen that film, the opening line to that film is this: we live in strange times. And the truth is, we do, don't we? We live in strange and peculiar times. And so as we turn to the scriptures, and in this case, as we turn to the book of Colossians, what does an ancient text have to say to us in our kind of cultural moment? And so the Apostle Paul, who writes this letter, we understand he wrote it along with Timothy. He's writing to the church in Colossae. Colossae was in what is now modern-day Turkey. And the church in Colossae wasn't a church that Paul had started. It was actually planted by a disciple of Paul, a guy called Epaphras. And now this letter was likely written while Paul was in prison, so around 62 AD. And he ends this letter by saying this in chapter 4 and verse 18, he says this. He says, I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. And as I've been reading through the book of Colossians over the last number of weeks, and I got to that verse, it kind of feels like a mic drop moment, doesn't it? You've got this kind of heavyweight, the Apostle Paul, who's paid tremendous cost to follow and to be obedient to Jesus. And if I was thinking about this, what would I do if I was writing this letter? And I was thinking about what would I say as my closing remarks? I'd probably say something like, I, Steve, write this greeting on my MacBook, with a flat white in my hand. Grace and peace to you. It's not as profound, is it? It's not as impactful. And yet we see this letter, this heavyweight Paul, who bears the scars and chains of following Jesus. And he's experienced all that, and he's still considering the well-being of the local church. He's still concerned about the church, even a church that he's never been to, he didn't plant, but he's considering their well-being. And as he writes this letter, there are a number of forces at play. There are a number of things he's addressing. And so, first of all, he's addressing a group of people called the Judaizers. And they were a group that went into newly found churches. They were people of Jewish descent. And they would say to the non-Jews who were following Jesus, in order to fully embrace the gospel, in order to fully be saved, you've got to observe everything of the Jewish law. And if you're a man, that meant a certain procedure. Okay, and so these people were trying to turn these new believers, these Gentile believers, into Jews and making them follow the Jewish tradition. And so Paul is beginning to address this in the church of Colossae. He does it a lot more in the book of Galatians, if you're interested in reading a bit more. But that's something that's going on in Colossae. That's something they're facing. The other force at work is godlessness within the Roman Empire. And this kind of cultural battle is going on between traditional religious prevailing views and the empire, and then the rise of godlessness in the culture. And so to get a grasp of this letter, we have to understand some of the context and the reality of this thing we call the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire ruled the world for 1,500 years. Because it existed for so long, there are still remnants of that empire that still shape and affect our lives today. The first would be things like Roman roads. I was going to sort of make a reference to the life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? But, one of the things they did was Roman roads. The first Roman road was built in 312 BC. By the 2nd century AD, there was 50,000 miles of roads leading to Rome. Some of them right on our doorstep. Some of them still in use today. And what those roads did were they built commerce and trade. But they also had a kind of sociological impact. Kind of the same way the internet did in the early 90s. And some of you are way too young to know that there was a world without the internet, but there was. And when the internet came into place, the world suddenly became smaller and everything got faster. We were able to access more things and do them far easily than ever before. And so a similar thing happened with these roads. When the Romans built these roads, suddenly other places and ideas and cultures were available. And so the development of Roman roads and the impact of the empire shrunk society. And those of us who remember a world without the internet, the dark times, we can probably relate to that, can't we? We can probably see that reality. The second culture shaping thing of the Roman Empire was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which was this celebration of this long period of peacefulness within the Roman Empire. In fact, the Romans did a fairly good job at maintaining law and order. And apart from the odd skirmish, they maintained peace for a long time. And that gave an overwhelming sense of security to its citizens. And you see, there are two things that Paul does in this letter that we're hopefully going to try and explore a little bit in the coming weeks as we begin to think about how could this ancient letter that Paul writes have an impact on us today, particularly in our own cultural moment. And so the first thing Paul does is in this letter is he reduces the importance of the power that the Roman Empire has. And for those people who felt a sense of protection from the empire around them, Paul begins to subvert it. As he writes to the church in Colossae, he plants this seed or this idea that Rome is not your hope, that the empire is not going to save you. And if Paul was speaking to us today, I think he would say something like this. He would say, the prevailing culture that surrounds you is not the place you're going to find hope. The Jewish philosopher Heschel says this: human existence cannot drive its ultimate meaning from society, because society itself is in need of meaning. And so the question that we're kind of trying to wrestle with is, in a post-truth culture, in a kind of turbulent political season in terms of the world that we live in that sense of unrest, in a time of extremism when things are taken to catastrophic outcomes, where do you and I find meaning and hope? Where do we place our hope? Do we look to the culture and the society around us and look for meaning in itself? Or do we look somewhere else? And this is where I think the book of Colossians collides or intercepts with our world and our lives. And the one thing I want to suggest is this: no matter how unique we think we are, all of our imaginations have been hijacked by the culture around us. And you see, we live in a culture that measures success in three distinct ways. And because the kids are in today, I can't tell you what those three things are. But I did put it into Chat GPT and ask it to rephrase these three things. And so hopefully you can work out what I'm saying as I say this. So the three things that shape our culture, they measure success in three distinct ways: with money, intimacy, and influence. Hopefully you get the subtlety of that. In the book of Colossians, in the book Colossians Remixed, which is one of the commentaries that we're using for this series, it says this: when a whole population dreams the same dream, empire is triumphant. An alternative to the empire requires different dreams, animated by a different narrative. And so as Paul writes this letter, he's saying, don't put your trust, don't put your hope in empire. Don't put your trust in the culture around you. Put your trust in something else. Put your trust in a different story. And right now, and I might be oversimplifying this, we live in a culture with a prevailing narrative that says money, intimacy, and influence, it's really hard to get out on your tongue, is the route to success. And you see, the stories we live out of are often shaped by the narratives written into our culture, which I would say is the empire of our day. One company that does a really good job at hijacking our imaginations is Walt Disney. And some of you are thinking, you can't pick on Walt Disney. But one company that, if there was ever a company in our world that hijacks our imaginations, it would be Walt Disney, except for the fact they also have the rights to Star Wars. And so that doesn't matter. We won't go there. Do you know that Disney, when they made a number of their animated films, they actually changed the endings of many of the stories? For example, The Little Mermaid was published in 1836 by Hans Christian Andersen. In the original story, the Little Mermaid drinks a potion in order to become a human so that she could dance like no other. But that comes at a price, because every time she dances, it's like she's dancing on swords and her feet bleed. The prince, who she's trying to win the affection of, he loves to watch her dance, but he doesn't actually end up marrying the Little Mermaid. He marries someone else, but he treats the Little Mermaid a bit like a pet, and she dances for him at his wedding. But at the end of the story, the Little Mermaid takes her own life. How about the story of Pinocchio? In the Disney version of the story, Pinocchio gets his wish, doesn't he? And he becomes a human boy. The original version, the first disaster is that Pinocchio steps on Jiminy Cricket and kills him. And this symbolizes an abandonment of his conscience. And eventually it leads to Pinocchio being hung. Not quite the animated story that we are familiar with. These stories and many like them were intended to teach life lessons and build character, but instead our culture, it edits the ending and says, when you wish upon a star, all your dreams will come true. Or have you noticed how in nearly every Disney princess story, she uses her femininity to get Prince Charming and live happily ever after? See, culture in its simplest and probably most generalized sense teaches us that if the three particular stars of money, intimacy, and influence are the things that we wish upon, then everything will become true. And so Paul to the Colossians is addressing the issues of the empire of his day, an empire that is hijacking and overcoming people's imaginations for an alternative story, a bigger story, one that's more profound, one that's more life-changing. The other thing that Paul addresses in this book is this thing called syncretism. Syncretism is defined this way. It's the attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, and schools of thought. And so when society is shrinking and speeding up because of, the empire's roads that are being built, ideologies begin to blend together. And suddenly the culture is driven by this plurality of beliefs and a mishmash of things. And we pick and choose the things we like, and the things we don't like, we just kind of put them down. And so we see in this letter Paul challenging that mentality. So that's kind of an introduction to this book and kind of an introduction to hopefully where we're going to go in the next couple of weeks, that we would gain bigger imaginations. We wouldn't be hijacked by the world around us. If you've got your Bible, let's turn to Colossians, and we're just going to look at the first section, Paul's introduction, and his introductive remarks to the church in Colossae. He says this, picking up in verse 3. We always thank God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, when we pray for you, because we have heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love you have for all God's people, the faith and love that springs from the hope stored up for you in heaven, and about which you have already heard the true message of the gospel that has come to you. In the same way, the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world, just as it has been doing amongst you since the day you heard it and truly understood God's grace. You learned it from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on our behalf, and who also told us of your love in the Spirit. And so, as I said, Paul is imprisoned in Rome at the time that he writes this letter. He's never met the church in Colossae. And we learn that he wants to come and meet them because he's heard so much about them. And so these opening remarks, let's have a look at this. These opening remarks, Paul says, we thank God. We thank God for you. Why? Verse 4, we have heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and the love that you have for all God's people. You know, in the New Testament, there's this inseparable link between loving God and loving God's people. In 1 John, it puts this way. It says, if a man loves God but hates his brother, he lies, and the truth is not in him. And so this kind of inseparable link between responding to the gospel of Jesus and loving his gospel community, the church. And, you know, we can't say we love Jesus, yet hate his body, hate his church. And I don't know if you've noticed, that's quite an easy position to take, isn't it? It's easy to think, I can love Jesus, but I'm not quite sure about the church. And you've heard me say this before, but we have a generation of people who really like Jesus and they hate his church. And on one level, you get that. And on one level, you can look at the church and you think, oh my goodness, it's like one of those face palm moments. And if you're not doing that, Jesus is, you know, and so sometimes struggling with the church makes sense. It's like, have you seen it? Have you seen what it's like? And as I heard someone say once, the church might be the bride of Christ, but right now she's a little bit ugly. And in many ways, that feels like a justified position as well. But could it be that if our position is to kind of have that attitude that I love Jesus, but I hate the church, could we be guilty of that syncretism that Paul is talking about? I'll just take the bits that I like, and the bits that I don't like, I'll leave over there. And as I've said before, the church is Jesus' bride, who he loves, he cherishes, who one day will be presented to him blameless and spotless, without blemish. She can be ugly right now, and it's easy to point out her faults, her shortcomings. It's easy to give up on her because often she lets us down. And yet the idea of a believer who doesn't belong is totally unheard of in the New Testament. And so we see Paul commends the church in Colossae, first because of their faith and the evidence of their faith, but also their love for God's people. He's like, guys, you're doing a really good job. You're doing a really good job. And he explains why that love for one another, because verse 5, what they have is stored up for them in heaven. The reason they love each other is because their hope is found in a bigger story. Their hope is found in a bigger outcome. It's not found in the prevailing story of the culture around them. It's not settling for empire. It's not settling for the Disney fairy tale ending. They love each other because their hope is stored in heaven. And this is good news. It's good news, but it's also bad news. It reminds us that we have a hope and a future. But the bad news for us, it also reminds us we're all going to die. That this life that we have, this short life that we have, is going to come to an end. Yeah, I don't know if you realize that, but the reality is, I'm going to be preaching at your funeral or you're going to be crying at mine. We're all going to die. None of us are going to live forever. However responsible we might be, however much we work out, however healthy we are, we're all going to die. And the question is, where have we put our hope? What have we hoped in? Have we hoped in that kind of Disney outcome? That everything's going to just work out fine and Prince Charming's going to come and he's going to rescue me and all of that. Is that what we've hoped in? You see, in a world like ours, in a culture that is drastically changing, the things that we might put our hope in are actually slowly eroding away. They're crumbling. And I think we live in a unique time. You see, there is plenty of people who see what we believe as followers of Jesus, and they think, what a load of old tosh. You know, why would you believe in something that, you can't see? And instead they say, you know what, we're going to put our trust in something that's more solid. Maybe we're going to put our trust in like the political system. We're going to put our trust in the political system because that's real, it's tangible, it has a real narrative, it has a real story, and we're going to grab hold of it. And yet in many ways, the political narrative, the political system around us, it's crumbling, isn't it? It's falling apart. So where do we put our hope? Do we put our hope in the nuclear family? If I just keep my people close to me, that'll be it. That's what I'll put my hope in. And yet we live in a generation where there's more lone parents than ever before. In the UK, there's 3.2 million lone parents. So if we can't put our trust in the empire, if we can't put our trust in the culture around us, the political systems, or even our own families, where do we put our hope? Where can we place our hope? A hope that's robust enough to give us a kind of an imagination to navigate such turbulent times. Where do we put our trust when there are certain factions in our culture that are trying to instill terror and fear into us? And when the main story that drives us is a narrative of fear, our tendency is to want to take control. And when fear holds our hearts and we try to grapple with this idea of a bigger story, we tend to respond in a couple of different ways. First of all, we can say, if I can't hold it, if I can't taste it, if I can't feel it, I don't believe it. And so we live devoid of any sense of mystery. And we just trust in the things that we think we can control. That's where we kind of put our trust. So I'm just going to put my trust in the fact that every month I get my salary and I could put this portion in this pot and it's going to earn interest. And one day, we kind of just put our trust in the things that we think we can control. And what tends to happen as we do that is we reduce the size of the world around us. The other way that we can do this is to make everything that is around us subjective. And so we try and base the story that's leading our life around what feels good. It feels right in my heart. It feels okay. It must be okay. I'm going to trust it. That's what I'm going to put my hope in because it feels nice. And you see, both of those responses are driven by our fear. So whichever way we go, whether it's control through what we can touch and taste, or whether it's through what we simply feel is right, both of these responses miss that sense of faith and risk. That I'm going to have faith to lean into a bigger story. The risk of putting our faith into something else. And you see, by trusting and accepting that, we get to experience a narrative that's far bigger, far more encompassing than anything the world around us can throw at us. And so we see in these times when there are kind of massive political upheavals, when family institutions are crumbling, when systems we've relied on are letting us down, we as the Church of Jesus, we face a challenge and we face an opportunity. You see, the challenge to us as a church is this: where is our hope? What do we hope in? Is it in those things that seem to be falling down around us? Or is it in a bigger story? A story that is bigger than any empire, any culture, any narrative that our culture can tell us. Here's the thing: even the Roman Empire fell. The great Roman Empire fell. Cultures fall. I often wonder if we're just a generation that's witnessing another empire fall. When we look at all the crazy things going on around us, is this just another moment where another empire, another system that tries to shape and form our lives is falling down? And so as that thing does crumble and fall, what are we trusting in? But as well as the challenge, we also have an opportunity, because the world around us also knows that the story that our culture sells isn't working. And people around us are realizing the narrative of money, intimacy, and influence isn't working. That institutions that were once seen as unshakable are breaking down. And suddenly fear and lack of control are entering into people's reality. And suddenly, for the first time in a generation, the church has an opportunity, and is actually seeing growth as a result. That people around, and especially those in the kind of 18 to 20s bracket, people are finding meaning and hope in a bigger story that Jesus has to offer. Some of you may have seen the report published by the Bible Society called The Quiet Revival. If you were around at Table Sunday last week, we talked briefly about this and how the story of our culture that holds to was that the church was this irrelevant thing. It was dying. It wouldn't exist in 20 years' time. All of those sorts of things. The church serves no purpose. That's been the prevailing narrative that we've been told. Yet in the last 6 years, church-going Christians now make up 12% of the population, up from 8%. In numerical terms, that's a growth from 3.7 million in 2018 to 5.8 million in 2024. That means the church in the last 6 years has grown by 56%. Why suddenly is the church growing? Well, there could be many factors. One of the factors is that a third of that growth comes from people who are from non-white backgrounds. So people who have moved into our country from other places. So that makes up a third of that growth. But could it be that some of the cultural markers that our society has looked to for the last number of decades aren't working anymore? And the opportunity of a lifetime is that people around us are looking for a better story. Could that be what we're seeing happen? One of the stats from that report says 31% of non-churchgoers say they would attend church if invited by a friend or family member. That rises to 34% in the 18 to 24 generation. That means for every 3 people you might invite to a place like this, where they have the opportunity to hear an alternative narrative, an alternative story. If you were to invite 3 people, one of them would come. One of them would have an opportunity to hear a different narrative. It also says this: over half of non-Christian churchgoers, so 56%, would be happy for a Christian friend to pray for them. So if you've got 2 friends, anyone got 2 friends, and you offer to pray, one of them would say, yes, pray for me. It's quite remarkable, isn't it? 18% of people you know would be interested in learning more about the Bible. I don't know about you, but those stats feel like an opportunity. They feel like an opportunity in a kind of cultural moment. And so those figures, I think, should give us some confidence, don't you think? That we carry the greatest story ever told. And it's not a story of money, intimacy, and influence, but it's a story of faith, hope, and love. I've gone on for too long. Why don't we stand?